All right, so in this video, we're going to look at a couple of examples of the new imperialism. So the first place we're going to take a quick look at is India. So in India, the process of the new imperialism starts in 1608 when the Mughal Empire allows the British East India Company, which is one of these joint stock companies, to set up a trading post on the coast. So this was one of these emporia, which was one of these trade warehouses. So this was a British emporia on the coast of India. Over the next century, the Mughal Empire had declined, through a series of internal conflicts and against the military of the British East India Company. So the British East India Company had its own military, and they were fighting on the edges of the Mughal Empire, trying to get better and better trade deals out of the Mughals. And so by 1757, the Mughals had been defeated to the point of ceding their tax money to the British East India Company. They were giving their own taxes to the British East India Company because the military of the British East India Company had defeated the government of the Mughal Empire. The next big event happens about 100 years after that, in what we call the Sepoy mutiny. You might also see it as the Sepoy Rebellion, and this happens in 1857. So this is when the British trained Indian soldiers, who were called Sepoys, rebelled against their British East India Company superiors. And the reason they rebelled the cartridges for their rifles were rumored to be lubricated with the fat of pigs and cows. So the bullets that they were firing were lubricated so that they would shoot down the barrel of the rifle better with the fat of pigs and cows. This is most likely a rumor. This wasn't actually true, but touching the fat or maybe consuming it when you rip open the envelope holding the cartridge would be against the rules of Islam and Hinduism, which is what most of the Sepoys would practice. And so they rebelled. So the rebellion was put down. But at this point, the British government takes over the control of India. This happens in 1858. And the Queen of the United Kingdom, Queen Victoria, names herself Empress of India in 1877. So this was a relatively straightforward, just conquering of India. And we see the British method of the British training Indian soldiers because they want them to follow the British methods. Okay, the other place we're going to take a look at is in China. And this is a much more complex story. So China, even up until the end of the 18th century, was an economic powerhouse. It still produced a lot of stuff, and people still wanted the stuff that China made. So China, even though it was not industrializing and China was really conservative, it was still an economic powerhouse. They did not want to trade with the Europeans. And they didn't want to trade with Europeans for a number of reasons. One, they thought that the Europeans brought instability. And they also believed that the Europeans didn't have anything to offer them. And so even when they did trade with Europeans, they had to trade in specific ports with government merchants. So they were not allowed to trade with whoever they wanted to or wherever they wanted to. They had to trade in specific ports with government merchants. However, as the British expanded their control of India, they began cultivating opium. So opium is a painkiller, and it's been used for thousands of years as a pain reliever, as something to help with medical care. So it's a medicine that's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But what the British start doing it is they start trading it, or they start selling it illegally as a recreational drug. So it's kind of the 19th century equivalent of heroin. And so what the British do is to open up trade with China, the British, again, illegally start trading opium to the Chinese. And as they do this, there's finally something that the Chinese want, or more accurately, need from the British. Now, for their part, the Qing dynasty asked the British to stop, but the British refused. So at this point, the Chinese take a large shipment of opium that was confiscated and throw it in the ocean. Nope. And we all know how well the British react to having their trade goods confiscated and thrown in the ocean. So this happens in 1839. And so in response to that, the British sail a bunch of gunboats through the Grand Canal. And the Grand Canal is a 1,000-year-old symbol of Chinese economic and political superiority. So the British sail these gunboats through the Grand Canal and threaten to blow it up unless the Chinese surrender. So this tactic will kind of informally be called gunboat diplomacy. And in 1842, the Chinese sign what's called an unequal treaty with the United Kingdom. And the reason this is called an unequal treaty is that the British get the island of Hong Kong and several other ports. They just give in to the British. A huge payment and other perks for the British people. So if you're kind of comparing this to what's been going on in the Ottoman Empire, this is kind of like the capitulations that the Ottomans signed with the other Europeans in order to make good on the loans they couldn't pay. The French are going to do the same thing. In 1844. This is going to lead the Chinese to resist and fight another Opium War. So that's what this thing was called. This was called the First Opium War. This will be the Second Opium War, and this happens in 1853. Over the course of the rest of the 19th century, other European powers and the Americans and the Japanese will do the same thing. So they'll carve out their own little piece of China's economy, and these are called spheres of influence. So this is not a full-out colony. Basically what a sphere of influence is that the industrial power takes over the economic production of that region. So they're not taking over the political stuff, and they're not trying to impose European or American ideas on the Chinese. They're just basically taking money from China. Now, of course, the Chinese will resist this. And they create a secret society called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. And the point of this secret society was to expel the foreigners. And this is going to lead to a rebellion. Now, the foreigners kind of derisively call the people in the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist, they call these guys boxers, right? Because of the fist. So these guys are known as boxers, and this rebellion is called the Boxer Rebellion. This happens in 1900 through 1901. And we really get a dream team of imperial powers come together to squash this. So if we want to jump ahead to World War I, basically anybody and everybody that was fighting in World War I teams up to squash the Boxer Rebellion. All combatants on both sides of World War I unite to do this. And this pretty much marks the end of the Qing dynasty, although it will limp along until 1911 when it is finally overthrown. Now, I do want to say one quick thing about Japan here. Because as we probably have talked about, Japan and China have kind of followed the same trajectory. They both tried to cut out the Europeans. The Japanese, being on an island, were much more successful at this. They were able to keep the Europeans out easier than the Chinese did. But the same thing is going to happen to Japan. A similar thing will force Japan to open up. Except this time, it's the Americans they show up in 1853. Threaten to blow up the capital. If they don't trade with the United States. And of course, Japan surrenders. And signs an unequal treaty with the United States. Pretty much the same thing as what happened to China just about 10 years later. However, the Japanese have a completely different reaction to this. Japan responds by quickly, almost miraculously, industrializing. And this miracle of industrialization is called the Meiji Restoration, named after the emperor who took Japan over. He was called Emperor Meiji. And this happens in 1857. That's when this starts. If we jump ahead 50 years, in 1905, Japan defeats Russia in a war over Chinese spheres of influence. I really can't describe how impressive this is, because 50 years before this, Japan was completely agricultural. They had not industrialized at all. And in 50 years, they managed to beat a European power in an industrialized war over a colonial holding in China. That is completely miraculous, the fact that Japan was able to do this. It's also important because this, the Russo-Japanese War, leads to the starting of the Russian Revolution. But we'll worry about that when we get into the last time period. So these are two big examples of the new imperialism. We've got what happened in India, and we've got what happened in China. In our next video, we're going to look at maybe the most egregious example of the new imperialism, which is what the Europeans did to Africa. So that will be our next video. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.